Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and actually delighted to discover that a group like this exists. It's really heartening in these times. My career began with the book that was mentioned by my father. He died young. He died at 60. He was a law professor at the University of Chicago, and had been a First Amendment scholar and written widely about the First Amendment, and had the aspiration to write a single volume for lawyers, but also for a general audience, that would somehow capture the intellectual history of freedom of speech at the level of the Supreme Court. He died in 1974 in the middle of this project, and left a manuscript of I think it was about 1,200 pages, and it was a first draft, literally a first draft. You know, I would give you something I'd written and say it was a first draft by way of saying it was still open to revision, but it was actually a sixth draft or an eighth draft. In this case, it really was a first draft, and each summer he would, he had time off from teaching, would read through what he'd written and enter marginal comments in the margins. So I had these sort of strata of marginal comments to work with in picking up the project after he died and preparing it for publication. So I actually spent the first decade of my writing, I mean, I was, beginning a career as a writer and was publishing in magazines, but the really defining experience was working on my father's book and immersing myself in constitutional law as a non-lawyer, and trying to figure out this editorial puzzle of how to complete the work of someone who was dead without appropriating it, while keeping it true to their vision and their voice. And I've thought recently about that project. It's a long time ago. It was ultimately published in 1988. I've thought about it a lot recently because the book now, for me, is a kind of time capsule all these decades later. He wrote it in the aftermath of the Warren Court. He wrote it at a moment when what was then referred to as the Nixon Court was forming. And it was published in the Reagan years, and it was published several years after I'd had a prominent sort of public duel with a judge. Some of you may remember the name Robert Bork. And that's now, decades ago. And at that time, it felt like there was a constitutional counter-revolution forming with respect to an expansion of constitutional rights in the post-war period, and particularly during the Warren Court era. We could hardly have imagined what has transpired since and where we are now. And my father's book was he had this image, this really lovely image, and he was a realist about the influence of politics and the judicial process. But allowing for all of that, there was an image at the center of the book of the law working itself pure. So in a given area, libel, public demonstrations, obscenity, the different array of First Amendment issues that were prominent at the time, this idea of the law working itself pure over time, buffeted by politics, but some kind of core integrity in the legal process that had intellectual integrity and just kept advancing in some fashion. It's a beautiful image. It's a hard one to credit at the moment, and the book gave just sort of infinite care to describing these small developments in constitutional law, the inching forward of clarity in different areas, and so much of it is now dated. you know, the book is in many ways so dated, and then there's some shocking ways in which it's not dated. There's a whole section, it's fully 100 pages, that deals, you would find this surprising in some respects, in a First Amendment volume, with immigration, you know, with exclusion of people from the country as a sanction against speech and political association, with deportation, with denaturalization, things that, you know, when I was working on the book in that era seemed so almost medieval, you know, medieval relative to prevailing understandings in the law. So there are things in the book, you know, coming out of the darkest part of the anti-communist era in the 50s that are highly relevant. But the thing that's most relevant, and what I most want to talk about today, and I'd be most interested to get your thoughts and reactions on, is that my father had this notion, which I've taken very seriously in the course of my career, that the First Amendment transcends the law, that the First Amendment is something more than a body of law, that it's a tradition of the society. And in one sense, you could say that of all sorts of constitutional provisions. But I think this notion of a tradition bears thinking about, and especially at a time like this, when you know, we may have some disagreements about it. Certainly happy to engage and entertain them, but you know, there's a swift transformation of the federal courts right now. There's been a kind of turning inside out of the First Amendment. You know, we thought decades ago that the sort of right would limit the First Amendment, and in curious ways they've upended it by embracing it. So now our whole political system has been set askew by the notion that money is speech, that the biggest multinational corporation is the same as any one of us as a single speaker. You know, these are Copernican shifts in our notions of how a democracy works and what the requirements of the democracy are. So, you know, and then all the changes that have occurred just in terms of the means of communication. Who could have ever imagined Facebook, Google, you know, that really the First Amendment is so directed at the exercise of state power, when in fact these other entities have much more influence over our discourse than anything else. So this, in the midst of all of our uncertainty and the sense of being kind of unmoored, and a lot, you know, it's easy to point at President, what's his name again? You know, as the source of this, but many of these forces have been moving for a long, long time, and you know, shaping the underlying conditions of democracy for years and decades now. And so I think there's never been a time when it's more important to interrogate the idea of the First Amendment as a tradition, and a tradition of which we as individuals, as citizens, as journalists, as teachers, are the ultimate guardians. And I think one of the curious things, and it might sound strange coming from somebody who spent a decade minutely mapping the course of judicial development with respect to First Amendment issues, and I've written a good deal about these things since, to say this, but I think one of the dangers in America is we think of our political freedom as something that is defined by legislatures and courts. You know, so we talk about the boundaries and the limits of the permissible speech in different areas. And as we review the great decisions, the landmark decisions, it's all in terms of this. And I think the notion of a tradition really resides with each of us. And there's something fundamental about it, because a tradition isn't a birthright. You know, a tradition isn't a birthright. A tradition has to be acquired. A tradition has to be passed on. A tradition has to be transmitted. And I think that's why the work that you do and the kind of disciplined focus you bring to it is so very critical, you know, and particularly in a time like this, where we're seeing major institutions of a democratic polity fail in their functions, and I think you know, in performing their roles. And at a time like that, it becomes critically important that citizens understand their role as the ultimate guardians of those values. And I think speech is freedom of speech and freedom of association are in a significant way different from a whole range of other constitutional values that you know, we can't, as individual citizens, provide just as single actors, as single agents. We can't provide due process of law, or freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, or, you know, the whole range of things, equal protection under the law, that we can't, you know, uniquely and distinctively as individual human beings and citizens do. We can speak, we can organize, we can publish, we can form associations with each other. And much of the history of freedom in the world, absent the First Amendment, in other settings, think about South Africa, think about Central Europe in the 70s and 80s, leading to the so-called Velvet Revolutions of 1989, were matters of citizens insisting on, under conditions vastly, you know, conditions vastly more challenging than the ones we face, insisting on their voices, insisting on the, just as a function of being human beings in the world for the brief time we have, their freedom to associate with who they want to associate with. And so that notion of generating power within civil society by speaking, by bearing witness to what happens, by reporting on it, I think is always critical. But sometimes when this society has been functioning as it was designed to, or roughly as it was designed to, in terms of the institutional dynamics, has been in some ways obscured by, you know, the fortunate conditions of a healthy democracy. At the end of the day, you know, it resides with us as individuals. And, you know, so the sort of question I would put to you, and the challenge is sort of, how do you teach that? You know, how does that get conveyed in a classroom? And I think one of the ways is, when you think about the First Amendment as a tradition, it means that the stories of, you know, our history is really uneven. And I'm sure, you know, you teach it this way. Our constitutional history is really uneven. We've had, you know, multiple periods of sort of constitutional amnesia, where we've really become unmoored from core values. And we've come to, you know, at later periods we recognize that. But, you know, it happens again, and we're now in a almost indescribably surreal period, you know, of being kind of unmoored, or the sensation of being unmoored. That's a hugely important part, it seems to me, of understanding the nature of the First Amendment. I would go so far as to argue that the debacles, the things we're ashamed of, the things, or you know, that we see in a negative light, are actually assets in our understanding of individual and political freedom, in a way that the moments of judicial and legislative clarity, the moments of the law working itself pure, to quote my father, those are also important. But I would argue that the debacles, the uneven history, the times we've lost our way, are equally important, and I think critically important now. You know, and I'm not sure, you know, high school students, I have to constantly remind myself with young colleagues how young they are, and you know that the references you make will just be completely inexplicable to them. You know, somebody made the touching remark. I can't remember who it was. It was a hip hop artist. Made the touching remark that for, you know, as of the end of the Obama administration, you know, 8-year-old children in the United States assumed that the President of the United States was black. You know, something that was an incredible watershed in terms of American history. You know, so for every child you live, and so for kids who have come into their awareness, you know, in the last decade or whatever, you know, I think the need to understand the uneven, turbulent, and kind of dialectical nature of the history is critically important, and I think kind of grounding and empowering. You know, I don't know how many people here have been to the National History. I mean, I always forget what it's called. The African American, because among black friends in Washington, it's called the Blacksonian, which is sort of stuck in my mind as what it should be called. But one of the things, and this, you know, it applies to every dimension of the aspiration for freedom and human dignity in our history, is I actually went to the Blacksonian 3 days after Trump had visited, and had given a press there were press around, and he said as he was walking out, "Wow, you know, Frederick Douglass really does some good work." You know, he sort of discovered Frederick Douglass for the first time, and if you haven't been there, you know, it's this extraordinary building in terms of architecture. And you start by going deep, I think 3 levels down underground, and it's actually fairly low ceilings, and the lighting's somewhat dark, and it's the beginning of the slave trade and the development of the slave trade, and you ascend by degrees into a building that then, you know, opens up and is beautiful and lit, and it's a very powerful experience. There's nothing touchy-feely about the museum, but there's an experience it delivers if you spend 4 or 5 hours there, which it minimally requires. And so, just walking across, you know, across the mall towards the museum, I was thinking, God, what are they going to do? How are they going to incorporate the Trump era? You know, how are they going to incorporate it in with this sense of upward movement into greater freedom and inclusion? Are they going to have a kind of slide that goes back down into the ground? I mean, what are they going to do with this just architecturally and as a matter of design? Having spent you know, 4 hours there, it was apparent, you know, the most surprising thing to me, and curiously the most heartening thing to me, was the museum completely includes Trump. It completely includes this moment in history. It completely includes, I always insist on calling him by his full name because it reminds us of the tradition he represents, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III. You know, these folks are represented in the museum because the history of expansions of freedom in America is the history of the African American drive for inclusion and freedom, and it's come to include women, come to include folks with a spectrum of different sexual preferences, but that's the core of our history, and we're finding ever more so now that it remains so. And at every moment where there's an expansion of freedom, there's a fierce counter-reaction against it, and it always looks like these guys. It really does, at every stage, you know, Reconstruction, Jim Crow in the South, hyper-segregation in the North. It always looks this way. So freedom is always freedom from something. You know, and I think the great error we made sort of post-1989 was imagining that that freedom had some notion of freedom had somehow prevailed in the world. And there's always the dialectical tension, and it's in human nature, and it's in tensions we may feel in ourselves, you know. And so I think in the teaching of First Amendment history, which, you know, it's can be gratifying to teach it as here is the eloquence of Holmes and Brandeis, and here are these moments, and, you know, New York Times versus Sullivan, and the Pentagon Papers, you know, the sort of landmark decisions as if these were the monuments of a sort. I think it's just a much more turbulent, dialectical, unresolved thing that requires us in every generation to be engaged in those arguments and in those struggles.